Hey and welcome, I'm Hammeh and today we'll be taking a look, I can't believe it, at Overwatch's 17th digital comic called London Calling, in which we learn loads of things about Overwatch, Tracer and her life post-Overwatch in London, as well as Omnics and their life in King's Row, before the events of Widowmaker's Alive and Winston's Recall shorts. I'll be going through all of the Overwatch lore talking points and interesting points of this surprise comic, along with a little light speculation on what new Overwatch story and lore we have learned from it too. Suffice to say, big spoilers for the comic, link for it is in the description below if you haven't read it already. Do head over to playoverwatch.com, please read it first and then come back to let me know your thoughts. Timecodes are in the description below if you want to skip around. Firstly, a quick summary of the story. In a post-Overwatch world, we find Lena Oxton, Tracer, reflecting on her Overwatch past life, but in the present day she is zipping through the streets and we see her chase down a bike thief, which is definitely a thing and a problem in London today even. After saving the day and saying she's just Lena when she's called Tracer by some of the crowd, people asking her if Overwatch is back and she says no, she's just helping out, Tracer heads home to Emily for tea, Emily being Tracer's partner even at this point in time. Asked about her day over Chinese takeaway, Emily gently mocks Lena for saving kittens from trees and asks if she's really happy. Although Tracer professes that she is, she thinks to herself about her days in Overwatch and knows that only Overwatch being back could really fulfill that side of her life. With Overwatch coming back being very unlikely in Tracer's eyes, she feels that she's only a part-time hero. Seeing police break up some Omnics while she's out buying a record, Tracer spots another Omnic with a package and chases them down. Bringing them to a stop, she's begged by the Omnic not to intervene, as it's a part to help repair the Underworld, that Omnics would not usually be sold. The Underworld, of course, being the place where Omnics live under King's Row, under London, in a ghetto-style fashion that you see in the levelling game. Bonding over their love of music, Lena meets Iggy properly, and the Omnic takes her to see her home and record collection. Tracer discovers a lot more about the reality of Omnic life in London and King's Row after the King's Row uprising and the fall of Overwatch, and she meets Iggy's housemates, Lady and Lizzie, with the gang kicking back together with their shared love for music. Tracer discovers how Iggy got their name and their love for music too, and as the two leave, she apologises for automatically assuming that Iggy was a thief. Tracer also offers to help any way she can, as to her it seems like what the Omnics are trying to do is just survive. Before Tracer can get her tea, or indeed home to Emily, her call inviting Emily to the pub is rudely interrupted by a gang of Omnics who are curious about her business in the Underworld. With the gang opening fire, Tracer recalls to put the battle in her favour, but her pleas fall on deaf ears. Even though she doesn't want any harm to come to the Omnics, the gang says she's not welcome in the Underworld, and no Omnic needs the help of a human, not even from Lena Oxton. Saying this doesn't end here, the gang leave, with a mystified Tracer left in their wake. Here's some of the interesting things I enjoyed from the comic, and analysis of all the little details too. Firstly, of course, we learn a lot more about Tracer's life after the downfall of Overwatch and what she's up to on a day-to-day basis. In the starting panels, Tracer said that if you asked her, she said she was a hero. Top job if you can get it, but of course, after the Petrosac pass in Overwatch ended, she wasn't sure what she was for a while. We learn a bit about her past. She tried to stick it out with the RAF, but that was a bust. Apparently, they wanted a pretty young Tracer at the time, let's be honest, to retire and sit behind a desk, presumably not be on active pilot duty, so she left. And in London, England, present day, we see Tracer needed to, in her words, do something, anything, and she needed to move. So she's kind of being a day-to-day semi-vigilante, I'd say in some ways, on a low level, helping out how she can in London. In the comic, we see Tracer chasing down and catching a bike thief while saying, "So yeah, I keep myself busy, helping out where I can," bouncing off the statue of what I presume is one of the statues in Trafalgar Square, although of course there are a lot of mounted equestrian statues in London. Calling them just little things, Tracer says that Emily calls them my compensatory heroics, which I think is a slightly kind, slightly mocking term in a way. And as Tracer returns the package to its owner, she gets questions that I assume she gets on a regular basis. "Hey, look, you're Tracer!" And she has to say, "Well, no, I'm Lena at the moment. Does this mean Overwatch is back? No, I'm just lending a hand." Although Overwatch is disbanded at this point in the storyline, Tracer's still very much a recognisable figure. It's worth mentioning here timing-wise that this is, of course, after Overwatch disbanded and is in some of the period of 7 to 8 years or so between when Overwatch disbanded and the present day of the storyline. Overwatch timelining an inexact science at best, but there are lots of relative dates that can be used, even if precise years are hard to come by. We also see a little bit more of at home with Emily and Tracer. Getting home, she's greeted with, "Still saving the day?" "Nope, all finished, all saved," says Tracer as she comes in and hangs up her chronal accelerator. Catching up on the day over a Chinese, Emily very gently says, "Any kittens out of trees today?" And Tracer says, "Oh no, it's boxes from bikers." And Tracer reflects on what she said earlier, doing whatever little she can, saying, "It's not Overwatch, but I want to help." In response to Emily saying, "You're happy doing this?" And Emily says, "Not answering my question." Ending the conversation with a smooch, Tracer, reflecting later, feels that she's mostly happy, having a look at her photos on the wall of various shenanigans in Overwatch, including a story that I want to see told, Tracer and Mercy cooking and setting a barbecue on fire. It seems like that would be a good mini-series on its own. And also, a nice little nod in the bottom right there, you can see Sojourn, along with Genji and Tracer in a little Overwatch photo. Looking forward to Overwatch 2 there. With Tracer reflecting that, for now, she's a kind of hero that's, well, part-time only. And she says it's going to be fine until there's a crash, as Tracer is buying a record. Now, the second thing we learn a lot about from this comic, as well as Tracer, is Omnic life in London and King's Row. And indeed, although this is in one location in the world only, it might be an interesting look into Omnic life post the downfall of Overwatch as well. Now, as Tracer walks away, having saved the package from the bike thief earlier, one of the crowd says she was one of the good ones. Now, of course, Overwatch was dissolved in disgrace as various transgressions that the organisation and its members committed came out, various corruption and other things were revealed. Some people were forced to retire in disgrace. Reinhardt, for example, may be one of those, we're not quite sure. It seems that there's some mystery around the circumstances under which he retired. But in this post-Overwatch timeline, the life of Omnics has not become any easier and seems to be getting harder, particularly in London by the day. Now, lest we forget the events of the King's Row Uprising, of course one of the Overwatch Archives events and the subject of its very own comic that you can check out. And do check out all of my previous comic and lore analysis of everything to do with Overwatch and its story in these playlists below, by the way, and you can see them at the end of the video as well. Let us not forget that Null Sector, an Omnic extremist organisation, took over London, was taking hostages, destroying things, killing people and citizens, and causing a lot of trouble. With the UK government reluctant to have any outside intervention, Jack Morrison, Strike Commander of Overwatch, sanctioned a mission for Tracer, Torbjorn, Mercy and Reinhardt to go in and to free the hostages from the power plant in King's Road, even though it was a technically illegal operation. Now, as explained by Gabriel Reyes in the Events of the Uprising comic, Omnic Rights and Omnic treatment, not only in London or the UK but around the world, had not been good for quite some time in terms of prejudice, in terms of discrimination and similar. So even with that going on beforehand, the events of the King's Row Uprising, of course, turned public opinion even more against Omnics. We see in the present day that they are being chased down by police. Although one person in the background says that the police aren't actually making things better, the other says this is the third time this month that there's trouble with Omnics in the neighbourhood. As someone shouts, "Police, there's another one!" as Tracer sees an Omnic grasping a package, Tracer chases them down with all speed, kind of going into immediate trying to help out mode. Now, whether that's just a quick reaction of Tracer's or kind of a belief that she has, we don't know. However, when she actually talks to the Omnic, they say that it's a modulator that they need for their grid because no one will sell them to us. And Tracer, on having the conversation, discovers it's, well, because we're bots. The two actually bond as the Omnic sees her Clash album in her hand. And as Tracer meets Iggy and is taken into the Underworld, she discovers a lot more about how Omnics are living in present day England and King's Row. The Underworld was built by Omnics from scratch, we learn. There are many Omnics there, and Tracer actually directly refers to Turing Green, a proposed Omnic development that Mondata was due to open before the events of the King's Row Uprising occurred. Meant to be a new home for the Omnics in London, Turing Green turned out to be, after the events of the Uprising, a disaster, and the Omnics in London were forced to build the Underworld from scraps, according to Iggy. Here Tracer is the outsider, and it's interesting as she walks through the weird looks she draws from various Omnics, and some of them basically being outright suspicious or perhaps slightly worrying. Showing Lena the grid, Iggy explains that it powers the Underworld, but it also helps the Omnics stay in touch and connect them all together. So it seems as if it's part power, maybe part sort of networking as well. With Iggy explaining that the supplies that Omnics are stealing are life and death. They don't want to take them, but if they can't be sold them or people won't sell them to them, then what else can they do? Tracer gets a real understanding for the conditions in which Omnics are living in London today. Getting back to Shay Iggy, Iggy introduces Lena to Lady and Lizzie, the Omnics housemates. Having a big fan moment over legitimate 1960s Beatles posters and vintage vinyl, the Omnics are actually happy that Tracer can appreciate it, because apparently not all Omnics feel the same, as there are differences in humans' attitudes towards Omnics and everything to do with Omnics, so apparently these same differences in attitude exist between Omnics and how they feel about humans too, understandably so. Connecting over their love of music, Tracer discovers a pair of headphones that are Iggy's, and we're shown and explained as to how Iggy both took their name and also found their love of music. The human lab tech that they worked with gave them their first bit of music, Iggy Pop's Lust for Life. As they leave, Tracer apologises, saying that she's sorry that she ran after and treated Iggy like a thief. And Iggy says, well, technically they were stealing, although Tracer says that it actually seems to be survival. Offering her help and saying that it won't be the last that Iggy sees of her, Tracer is on her way, putting in a quick call to Emily to meet at the pub before she has to hang up due to the appearance of a mysterious gang of Omnics. These Omnics want a few words with Tracer about her business in the underground, and attempting to secure her, Tracer is not going to be someone who's easily secured. Having been open fired on, using a quick recall to turn the tide in her favour of the fight, Tracer turns around and is really confused. Saying that a friend asked her for help today and no one stands between her and her friends, Tracer ends the fight and says she doesn't know what's happening, she doesn't know if it's an Overwatch thing or something to do with Overwatch in the past, she doesn't want to hurt anyone. But she is told specifically, you are not welcome in the Underworld. Even though she wants to help, the Omnics say no Omnic needs the help of a human, not even you, Lena Oxton. This does not end here. And as the gang walk away, a mystified Tracer is left standing in the street. To be continued. So last but by no means least, a few thoughts on the timings of this in the story and what will happen next. Well, we get a big hint from the next issue teaser. As Tracer searches for parts to repair the Omnic's grid, she attracts the attention of two very different Omnic leaders, Case, who distrusts humans, and Mondata, who dreams of human Omnic equality. But at his rally, Tracer discovers just how fragile Mondata's dream is. So we're not precisely sure of the timing of this right now, but as far as we know, it's of course between the time of Overwatch disbanding and obviously the events of Recall and Alive. Obviously Mondata is alive if he's showing up in the next comic, and we know that in the events of the Widowmaker and Tracer Alive short, sadly Mondata meets his demise. So who is Case? What is going to happen at this rally? And what else are we going to learn about Tracer and her time in between Overwatch and of course the events leading up to the animated shorts and of course Overwatch 2? I can't wait to find out. Thanks very much for tuning in to this analysis of Overwatch's London Calling digital comic. Now there's going to be one of these a month, apparently, for 5 months, coming out both on playoverwatch.com and Dark Horse Digital. There's also going to be a Tracer comic event that's going to be starting tomorrow, the 15th of September, so keep an eye out as to how you can play to get a new skin and more cool stuff in that as well. If you liked the video, throw a like, subscribe, comment with what you thought of the story, what you'd like to see coming next. It's so great to have Overwatch Lore happening again, and we now know that there's some coming a little bit a month for the next few months. I've actually analysed in the past all of the Overwatch comics, shorts, lore, story interactions, voice lines, short stories and more. So if you'd like to see everything to do with Overwatch Lore ever since Overwatch launched and before, there's years of my videos here in the playlists. Cheers for tuning in. I've been Hammeh. Take it easy.